Today's talk is a second attempt at what we discussed yesterday when our camera overheated. The focus of our discussion is the fact that Tesla or China has something called the Catfish Management Process, which is being utilized in the case of Tesla. We explore what this is and what the implications are for Tesla. The second thing that we covered today is we actually have, in our last show, we got an opportunity to get some input from a China expert formerly living there. And he gave us a nice list of things to think about as we enter the Tesla China heavy-duty zone. And then finally, we're going to review why it is we're putting so much time into the China angle of this whole thing. This is Greg for Teslafaninsight. Thanks once again for joining us. If this is your first time on our channel, welcome. If you're a repeat visitor, welcome back. Wanted to note we also would appreciate your support on Patreon as well as a subscription. It makes a huge difference in the viability of the channel. We'd be greatly appreciative if you do so. Also wanted to mention that we do have some ads. By watching 10 seconds of that, it also is a support to the channel. So today we're shooting at a time designed to give us better access to non-overheating camera, but we get the benefit of some nice views to boot. What our first sort of discussion topic focuses on a management technique called catfish management strategy. So what is this and why and who? So the head of sort of all automotive in China within the government indicated that they're basically unsatisfied with the speed with which the domestic manufacturers of cars have been bringing forward new technologies. They have a pretty large goal that we've talked about, which is to have about 7 million EVs a year sold by 2025. And they are the largest car market in the world with about 23 million vehicles a year. The problem they're having is they're at about 2 million EVs sold. But the other problem is there is a sort of another issue that's popping, which is that they're ramping, but there's a dearth of 200 to 300 mile vehicles that a lot of customers would be grateful to see. So what this basically means then is that, you know, China is not really meeting the objectives they have as a stair step to what their goal is to eventually getting rid of all ICE vehicles. So the head of automotive in China indicated that they've introduced something called the catfish management technique. And what this means is that what the concept came from the fact that there was a ship captain in Norway, and he found that in Norway, the value of sardines that are alive is 3 times the value of frozen sardines. So he had to devise a way to get these sardines to stay alive so he could sell them at a great price at market. He came up with a secret that he refused to reveal until he actually died. And what that secret was is that all you have to do is put a catfish in with the sardines, and those catfish are basically swimming for their lives, or the sardines are swimming for their lives from the catfish, and in the process you now have a live fish that you could sell at the end. Now let's port this over into the automobile business. In this case, what the goal then of China is to take the folks from Tesla and use them as a vehicle to sort of prod domestic manufacturers into faster innovation to deliver on the promises of what China's trying to achieve when it comes to EVs. We're kind of shocked, surprised by this comment, because one could argue that there's a triangulation process going on where, yes, Tesla's being brought in, and yes, this catfish management process is possible. We're a bit surprised by this for a bunch of reasons. The biggest reason is that between subsidies to consumers to buy EVs and subsidies to EV companies to start producing vehicles, China has helped sort of fund about 500 EV companies. Of those companies, they've sort of boiled down to 50 that are actually operating, and then of those 50, they're further culling down to someplace in the 5 to 10 of these EV companies that are currently in place. Examples include BYD, catl, that makes batteries. You've all heard about NIO, and because they went public on the New York Stock Exchange. So the real interesting question mark then is, after you spend $60 billion, one would think that the country is really focused on making sure all of those investments do well versus getting wiped out. Instead of doing so, the Chinese government has put up, at this point, we think they're in about $6 to $8 billion helping to create Tesla's new factory. And based on a bunch of the things we've covered in previous shows, it's our belief that in the early going over the next couple of years, Tesla likely takes between 50 and 75% market share in EVs once consumers have an opportunity to get vehicles that can almost reach ranges. You eliminate range anxiety, as you know, from Tesla, but once those vehicles can now reach ranges that include 300 to 500 miles, you all of a sudden have a setup now where consumers can be a lot more comfortable. A sidebar note here is, I don't know if you guys have heard about it or read about it, but Shanghai had one of the most amazing traffic jams in human history. They have, and evidently they're common in Shanghai, and what happened is that the traffic jam was so bad that the vehicles were unable to move for maybe 2 days. So it was a complete catastrophe. And what I kept wondering about is, as I learned that many of the EVs produced by domestic manufacturers were of the 100-mile-ish type, I was really surprised because, bottom line, you have a country that's pretty big that has to travel long, and people have to travel long distances to and from. And so by not having efficient supercharger ability and as well as decent length range, you end up with people having to charge up every night or multiple times during the day. It's a complete disaster. So I could see in general why it is that there's a preference to port over to the product offerings given by Tesla. The next issue is you're $60 billion in with these manufacturers. One would think that China might have been inclined to avoid going to Tesla and really concentrate on letting these EV companies evolve into sort of better execution. And clearly the pollution problems they're having, as well as the benefit of being able to sort of monitor Tesla more closely as it rolls into China, enables them to maybe leapfrog faster than a normal process would allow. So our assessment is, wow, that's kind of a shock for them to spend that much money already, but still be focused on executing their plan, which is to get rid of ICE engines in the 2040 timeframe. And they weren't getting there very quickly, so one of the many reasons they brought Tesla was this reason. So this dovetails into sort of the next segment of the show, where we actually have a viewer who's Chinese, and he sort of ran through some of the elements of the decision-making process of the Chinese government relative to EVs. And one of the elements that sort of dovetails nicely with this part of it is that what he indicated is, China is a 20, 30, 50-year thinking entity. So as they're implementing these changes and solutions that we're seeing, one needs to consider the fact that, bottom line, they're not just thinking about the next 2 or 3 years or 5 years. They're thinking very long term, and therefore they're trying to get solutions that will ride out that long. And they want to get there quickly because of how important the pollution issues are within the country. The second issue raised by our viewer is we had a discussion going where many of our viewers were mentioning that it's likely that we're looking at prison labor when it comes to production of Tesla vehicles in that Shanghai factory based on a lot of variables. And what was indicated as well is that, the bottom line is that there's most of the factories actually have housing there. It eliminates issues regarding traffic, etc. Plus, many of the workers are actually immigrating long ways to work. And by paying slightly more, Tesla gets the best workers, and those workers prefer an environment with housing that we just described. So, bottom line is that it might look like prison labor to us in terms of conditions, but without a setup in this fashion, Tesla wouldn't be competitive in terms of access to all sorts of talent and resources if they did not do what they're doing. The third point he made that I thought was pretty on point is the whole idea of core competencies. So we've made light over time of the fact that Bob Lutz has predicted Tesla would fail or go bankrupt. And in general, the logic stream is, if you look at the distribution process as well as the balance sheets of the huge companies that Tesla's competing with in the auto business around the world, there should be a fairly quick dismissal of Tesla by these companies as they introduce large numbers of new EVs. The issue, though, is that it ain't happening. And what he highlighted there was the fact that the core competencies relative to EVs is fairly different than the core competencies related to ICE vehicle production. So when we're hearing comments from ICE executives who grew up in that industry, it's very hard for them to truly sort of have mastery of the core elements of how and why an EV might be successful, or an EV company. And so therefore, the comments that are being made represent their best knowledge of how things work. But because it's not their core competencies, they're not really able to really grasp process very well. Another element of the argument he made, which I thought is on point and totally agreed, is that from a couple of different angles, it was suggested that one of the problems that's being had when it comes to large manufacturers currently porting over to EVs is that if it was just one element of, for example, battery that you had to deal with, it'd be pretty easy for these folks it'd be very easy for folks to simply make the transition quickly. But the argument was made, it's a lot like peeling an onion. First, on the outer layer, you're looking at a battery, then you're looking at software control, then you're looking at thermal management, then you're looking at the supercharger network. And so as you keep layering on, these small and large elements, you start to realize that, wait a second, it's a lot more complex to respond than one would think. And you really have to build a solution from scratch and build up those competencies before you can really take steps forward that are dramatic. So the bottom line here is that, yes, you have a lot of people spending a lot of money to catch up to Tesla, but there are a lot of variables that are influencing their ability to make the transition quickly. And so the fact that we're seeing these huge companies expend a lot of cash and not get very far when it comes to pushing the threat of Tesla back should be no surprise. The next thing we wanted to sort of flow into is the fact that one of the product differentiation methods being used by Tesla to consider is the fact that VW is really planning a very high-speed charging process for their vehicles in advance of things like superconducting, etc. And Tesla just announced that they're moving to like a 15-minute charge up of vehicles. So bottom line is that Tesla is starting to close out openings that competitors have to differentiate themselves when it comes to customers. And I think this further complicates the gap close that all these companies are trying to achieve. So there's obviously a lot of moving parts here, but the bottom line is the Chinese are committed over the long term to be successful. And one other angle that I wanted to toss in that I'm fascinated by is it's unclear how this is going to line up, because there's a discussion even in the case of our friend from China of the fact that it'd be a good idea to build production facilities across the globe to support Tesla. But he also highlighted the fact that China really has a 50% cost advantage in labor, among other things. And so one of the things that's popping up is it possible that you end up with, between Korea and China and maybe one other location, a very high concentration of where these vehicles are being produced for around the globe, because it's a lot more efficient to do so relative to cost. There's a quick comment that was popped up on about the earnings that come out this week being, pretty important. I would say that in general, where the stock price is now is ballpark a sign that all the hedge funds and so forth know where the stock is going to end up after earnings are announced. And so I almost think that what's bigger than the earnings is the after earnings announcement about what the order book looks like, how many vehicles they'll be able to produce in China based on an increasing amount of batteries available. I just think there's a lot of other questions that are going to be answered at that announcement that I think will be more influential than the individual number of earnings, because as you may recall, in the United States, you could extrapolate on average what the price is of a U.S. vehicle, and then I believe the number is $54,000, and then calculate number of vehicles sold, and then you have a pretty good sense of what revenue was for that. So the point is that there are a lot of ways to sort of anticipate what the earnings numbers are based on the number of vehicles that have been announced already. So there's a lot of information that's baked into the current stock price. And so I think there'll be some movement, 5 or 10 points, but I do not believe it'll be a dramatic shift in price based on the information that's revealed. Now, on the other hand, when it comes to new news relative to China growth in sales and production, that could actually be influential. Same thing in terms of an order book that's large or built out dramatically in Europe that was unexpected. So we'll see how this plays out, and I think we're optimistic, but I kind of find that when you look at how many EVs China wants over the next several years, and the fact that Tesla represents their best solution between now and then, I just think that their thumbprint on Tesla's future over the next 3 to 5 years is pretty powerful, and it's going to tilt the weight one way or the other about how the company is going to do, hence why we're putting a lot of time into it, because a lot of the other things that are going on are in pretty good command. Perhaps my final note for today is that I wanted to highlight that we're a bit surprised on the Chinese process right now, because after you spend $60 billion, you would think they would be, they'd be reluctant to sort of blow up companies they put that much money into, but it does highlight the eagerness with which China is trying to make progress. And if Tesla is the way to do so rapidly, they're open to making the changes to do so. I also wanted to note that I think it's kind of funny, strange with Tesla, because typically, China has been known to copy aggressively what other people are doing and then sort of leverage that aggressiveness into sort of taking over those industries. And many of our viewers have talked about that being a possibility when it came to EVs. I do think that's a possibility. However, as we noted numerous times, the fact that the batteries are being kept in the production process in Nevada versus shipping that to China immediately means that there's still a lot of information that Chinese don't have, and they're able to use Tesla's open patents to kind of close the gap to some extent, but haven't been able to do so completely. This is a side note that came out over the last week that you should be aware of, and that is that Tesla announced that there's a possibility that they're going to start producing their own batteries versus using the Panasonic production facilities that are at the Gigafactory. As you know, Panasonic and Tesla are the primary two partners that paid to have that plant built. And so, it's another noteworthy item, to consider. We're starting to enter the hot part of the day here during the summer, and which kind of hurt our ability to finish our last show. I wanted to note that we're very much looking forward to the next earnings. We appreciate all the comments made by those of you who had a chance to join us live. We look forward to getting comments on the show. Please remember to like and subscribe, and we actually look forward to constructive comments that you might have that adds to the knowledge base of what we're discussing here today. Please remember, I'm going to do my 25 leg list right now with a 5-pound weight, along with reminder, don't go to bed within 2 hours of eating, preferably 4 hours, to make sure you sort of manage the health effects well and don't get acid interjection or cancer out of it. Anyway, have a great day, and bye for now. Tschüss, macht's gut, au revoir, lehitraot, choda hafez, and in Jamaica we say enough respect, walk good, ni hao ma, tschüss.